Hello and welcome to the Unusual Stories podcast. My name is Wojciech Salski, I'll be your host for today. And as per usual, before we start, may I remind you, if you find this podcast useful and you would like it to be shared with the world a bit more, then please do click the follow button, subscribe or whatnot, and do not hesitate to share it with a friend. It helps a lot. The word of mouth is the best kind of a way, and so I appreciate any help. Otherwise, if you'd like to support it in any other way, or you would like to just reach out to me and let me know something, whether you'd like something to be different or whether you think I'm doing a good job and you just want to pat me on my back, then please do follow the link below and you have all the options there. I deeply appreciate all the time you guys put in to share with me your ideas and thoughts. And since I've had quite a few by now, thank you for that. It's encouraging, and I'm here to stay for sure. So we might as well get acquainted a bit more, let's say. Anyhow, today I would like to present to you a book by Nassim Nicholas Taleb called The Black Swan. And The Black Swan is basically about the impact of the highly improbable. So first and foremost, before I start, the book itself came about to me in a way of a synchronicity, if I can say so, a coincidence, which I don't think is a coincidence. I thought about this book for a while. I had it written in my list of books to read. And then I've encountered it in the second-hand bookshop, actually in Inverness, one of the very famous ones that has a very peculiar setting because they have a full-on sort of open fireplace in the middle of a second-hand bookshop. So you can imagine that's quite a peculiar way of keeping fire going, and I do wonder how many times they actually used some old books to start the fire, maybe from the pages that fell out or something. Anyhow, I did pick it up, and even though I did consider it to be quite a challenging read, of which I will be sharing some thoughts in a moment, I decided to explore it, and I've just literally finished it a few days ago. I do found it very, very useful and interesting, especially the second part of it. So the first part of the book, the first half, let's say, is much more technical, and you kind of have to dig through it to understand it so you can enjoy the second part, which is a much more sort of light read and a bit more applicable to everyday life. But you could say it's a popular written scientific book. There is nothing in that book that will make you not understand what's going on. It might just be quite difficult to start with because Mr. Taleb puts out quite a few technically called concepts with which you need to become acquainted before you can sort of grasp and enjoy the message of the book itself. So I found it really fun, especially after reading Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, of which I've already created an episode, and I will share with you a link below for that book. I found this book to be a sort of a book building on top of that one, especially in terms of the impact of the highly improbable. So let's start with this. What is a black swan to begin with, right? You might say, well, Wojtek, I don't really know what you're talking about, and that's fair enough. I didn't really know it either when I was getting to that book. So a black swan is something that you might be familiar with if you deal with a sort of stock exchange, or if you're working in any field related to predicting the unpredictable, which is a funny little play on words because, as it says, you cannot really predict the unpredictable, but you can sort of mitigate within the confines of our understanding and assume some plans, as they call them, contingency plans, especially in business-related fields, in terms of the unexpected to occur. So a black swan, as mentioned and sort of defined by Mr. Taleb, is formed out of three things, three aspects make a black swan a black swan. So first of all, it's an event that happens outside the regular expectations. It's something that we have not foreseen, something that comes out of the blue, and often the second part with extreme impact to either our life, our business, the stock market, the world, and the third part of this is that in retrospect we tend to come up with reasons and call it predictable. So, they do say hindsight 2020, right? Or in hindsight, I should have done that or I should have done this. Well, obviously, it's very easy to assume what you would have done and what would have, could have happened, should have happened, looking back. But it's not obvious that you would actually do that and foresee that. And especially with our arrogance, of which I will be talking in a second, and our overestimation of our abilities and underestimation of the things that are out of our control that have impact on our lives, we humans tend to sort of simplify things in hindsight. So, for example, COVID-19 is a good example of a black swan, or a market crash in the stock market, or the bursting of the dot-com bubble. So these events, even though looking back, you can say, well, of course, there were so many different sort of markers that this could have happened, or we should have done this, and obviously it wouldn't happen. It's very easy to say such things in hindsight, but as we are before the event to occur, and if we do consider it to be a black swan, then obviously that's an event that was outside of the regular expectations, so we simply could have not foreseen it. And there is a whole science group to which Mr. Taleb is sort of a namesake, a stamp of a sort, which deals with the highly improbable. And especially in the military, that's something that is sort of dealt with on a consistent, ongoing basis. But it is very difficult because of the definition itself, right? It's very difficult to know what you don't know. And you can anticipate what you don't know, but the fact that you don't know it makes it highly improbable to be as you would think it to be. So, I'm obviously, pardon me to explain things that are much more complex than I'm making them, about which I will share in a second. But basically, for sure, the black swan, if it does occur, whether in your life or in the world or in whatever shape or form, this is an event that is unlikely to happen, pretty much impossible to foresee, with extreme impact, and about which later on we come up with all kinds of explanations of why it could have happened and should have happened in the first place. Now, let me stop for a moment and bring up some ideas and a great example from the book to sort of portray it. So the paradox of this sort of foreseeing the future is that, as Mr. Taleb points out, it's very difficult to foresee things that have never taken place to begin with. So, for example, there is a story, sort of a portrayal of this, about a turkey. So imagine a turkey is being held in some farm, and it's fed for 1,000 days. Every day at 5 o'clock, let's say, tea time, it gets fed. So from the standpoint, the perspective of that turkey, every day at 5 p.m., it will get fed. And it's okay, it's great. Now on the 1001st day, it gets killed at 5 p.m. and it's served because it's, Thanksgiving dinner or whatever. That's the kind of an event for that turkey that we would say is a black swan, right? It's outside the regular. It is highly impactful for its essential being. And looking back at it, you could say, well, of course, at some point the turkey would be eaten because it's being fed for something, right? It's not for fun. But, obviously, yet again, this is our arrogance and the turkey's arrogance to sort of look back and be like, oh, of course. Now, the paradox of that is that we do not know what we don't know, and thinking that we know something makes it harder for us to think what we don't know. So look at this example of the turkey. The fact that every day it becomes more certain that every day brings new feeding time, and every day it's great, nutritious meal on the plate, let's say at 5 p.m. That knowledge slowly but surely, consistently narrows its potential skeptical vision of what might occur. So, it would be very different if every other week something would occur that is out of the ordinary. For example, instead of being fed, it would be weighted, or instead of being fed, it would be sort of felt around to see how thick its thighs has gone. So in these certain examples, the out of the ordinary might make it more likely that the turkey will be more skeptical about the future, a bit more wary of what might happen. It doesn't mean that it will be able to sort of oppose the inevitable, but in the example, because every day it's just being fed, it slowly but surely becomes certain that every next day is just the feeding time. And looking at it from our perspective now in life, a useful thing here to consider for a moment is how often do we get so sort of used to certain ways of our life being that when it actually does sort of suddenly change, whether it's something very upsetting that takes place or whether it's something, very unlikely but happy, a lucky occurrence, let's say the synchronicity that takes place, that we have not foreseen it at all. And oftentimes we are kind of caught with our pants down, so to speak, right? Especially when it comes to those unlikely negative impact events on our life. So, taking this into consideration, an invitation from Mr. Taleb to begin with, is to be more skeptical of what you think you know and be more wary of sort of planning and anticipating the future. And now the paradox of this is greatly portrayed, and now I'm sort of switching to a different gear, but on this working on top of that turkey example, is the paradox of that which did not happen. So let's say that you track careers of two sports people. One person is consecutively winning and they're being recognized more and more, their success grows and they're every day getting better and better at their sport, and overall, they become the world star. At the same time, there is another person that is working very hard on their craft and sort of training and trying, but they fail. They fail once, they fail the second time. They might have even been beaten by the first person from the example. And over time, they don't become the world star. Now, the thing with that is, us as spectators, if you watch Olympic Games or if you watch films, dramas, watch films from Hollywood or whatnot, you only see those that made it. Similarly to looking back at history, we only learn, for the most part, about those that did something, unexpected or amazing, wonderful, or did something very horrible and powerful and painful for the world. We don't see that which has not been sort of written down because it did not happen. So for every book that is written and published and becomes a bestseller, there are hundreds of thousands of books, if not millions, that don't. They don't make the cut. Similarly, for every king and city and country in the history of the world that made it and about which we know so much, there are potentially tens, if not hundreds, of others that didn't. And the paradox here is something that really sort of struck me as a great explanation of why, for example, in politics, in many countries, Poland is a great example for that. There is a huge short-sightedness in politics because it doesn't pay off as much for the image of the person who does something to prevent an event from happening, as much as for that who helps to mitigate the effects of the event after it happens. So let me just give you an example. Let's say that there was gonna be some sort of terrorist attack in a city, and the governor of that city, with the knowledge about this, with the suspicion that something will happen, prevents it. For example, by introducing a certain number of military police and police officers on site, and the marathon, which was takes place, and nothing happens. The terrorists did not attack. Now, that mayor might announce that, this happened, but because nothing really happened, because he prevented it successfully, the public will take notice or not. But considering the media outlets are much more likely to show things that are sort of shocking and graphic and horrific, it might not even make the news, even if he did want to announce that this is what happened. Some skeptics might say, well, you're saying that you prevented something, but since it didn't happen, we don't know if you actually prevented it in the first place. Now, take that same example, and let's say the mayor does not know this attack will happen. So the marathon takes place, some horrible stuff happens, the terrorists attack or whatever, some upset, unhappy people take, vile action. And now the city is in crisis and the mayor steps in. They bring out the police, they catch the assailant, and they mitigate by getting hospitals to help the victims and whatnot. And then after all that happened, the media has covered it. And now suddenly the praise might occur, showing, well, look at our mayor, look how great he acted in this courageous act, the difficult moment for our city. And by that, the mayor will get sort of recognized for the things they did. These two examples are starkly different, right? In one example, no one got hurt and everything was okay. In the second example, someone got hurt, potentially some people died. Yet in the first example, people will not recognize the mayor's act as much of value as in the second one, even though the impact of his action is much better, much higher than of that second one. Well, unfortunately, this is how, for example, in politics, the tenures and sort of show-off works. So it is not obvious that what the politician to keep being the president for the next cadency, next tenure, might want to do is exactly in the same long-term strategy to benefit the country. So, for example, which basically means that short-term solutions might be more preferable for a politician wanting to keep their career going on the rise than actually the impact valuable actions to take place. Let me give you an example. You know, if I'm the president and if I were to start a project now that will take 10 years to be finished, but it will greatly benefit the country, the problem with it that I might have is if I want to get the second cadency in the next 4 years, I will much more likely, I might choose some project that will take 2 years to complete so I can show what I've done. In contrast, someone that would genuinely think about the country's benefit rather than their own benefit, which is a paradox because obviously the politicians are not there for fun. They're there because that's their career. They might choose something that is much more valuable for the country itself, but then they won't be the ones to be called the great makers of that. Because if I started building this, I don't know, new highway, and in 10 years' time the president opens the highway because it's ready, they will be recognized by the majority of people that have no idea that I was the one to start it, and that person will benefit from my project, then I will. And, you know, I think this is something that can be related to anything in our life, and it might be worth considering for yourself, especially in your career or sort of when you're dealing with some projects that might take longer or might benefit others rather than yourself in the long term. You need to be aware of it. You know, I'm not trying to moralize here or point to in the direction what to do or what not to do, but it does, in my opinion, it is valuable to recognize what is your motivation and sort of be aware of the choices you're making, because they will have impact anyhow. And the question is, what are they going to impact, and in what way are you going to be affected and those around you? Now, an interesting thing here, and you know, let's continue. I gave you some things to think about, and I think by now I should get to the next point. It's very interesting. I mentioned earlier arrogance, right? So arrogance and ignorance are the two words that really come to mind when I'm thinking about this book, as the terms that we might want to call ourselves. And I truly mean ourselves, me included, you included, yes, your wise uncle included, or your all-knowing mum as well, or, you know, your spouse that obviously knows best. Everyone, and some of us might manage to sort of curb this, but for the most part, especially because we don't know what we don't know, we tend to be arrogant about our knowledge and ignorant about things and our own lack of capacity to deal with stuff. Now, a quote here, let's say, that I paraphrased a little bit, comes from one of the chapters, which is actually inspired by Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman and the experiments that he conducted, that we greatly overestimate our abilities and underestimate the impact of the lack, randomness, or chaos, if you will, of the world. And what I mean by that is basically, as people, as species, as individuals, we tend to think we know more and think we do better than we actually do in the grander scheme of things. And we often underestimate the impact of the world around us which might have an impact on our lives or on our actions. So an interesting experiment that they've done, and I don't have the numbers here. This is just, sort of to mention. Please make sure to read the book and actually check the numbers for yourself. I didn't want to bore you with some statistics here, but basically, for example, they did a study about driving abilities in Sweden, and something like 60% of people answered that they are better than 90% of drivers. So obviously you might see here that it's impossible for 60% to be better than 90%, right? Similarly, they did that about lovemaking, funnily enough, in France. And yet again, the French were greatly overestimating their love abilities in comparison to their peers. And this goes on and on. I think you could do a little example for yourself and even your immediate vicinity. Let's say you bring 5 friends together and you give everyone a piece of paper and you ask them to write in which percentile do they think they are in terms of their, driving skills. And you might be surprised or not surprised after this podcast or reading this book that actually the majority of us will overestimate how great we are. And this is a big thing, a big problem if you think about it, because if we do overestimate over and over our abilities, and we underestimate the likelihood and the impact that other things and people and events might have on our life, then first of all, we're setting ourselves up for a big surprise, so not necessarily the pleasant one. And secondly, we might really be living through a sort of an illusion or delusion really of a sort, because, for example, it is very unlikely for anyone to become the next biggest music composer or artist. The effects of for example, let's say there might be Taylor Swift or Queen or some other artist that basically broke the world, kind of split it in half and created their own place. It is not really only up to the talent and skills of that footballer, musician, artist, painter, bookseller, whatever, publisher, that they've made it. It is all also very much so up to luck. Mere luck and some synchronicity, maybe being in the right place at the right time. And this is, I wouldn't say it's to discourage you from following your dreams or sort of wanting to aim high. I think that's quite good to do. I do it myself all the time. I'm very ambitious, if anything, but it does. It might be useful, especially to to sort of to curb your expectations, or maybe just not be so disappointed with your setbacks, to recognize that ultimately it might be much more. Your success might be much more reliant on a sort of synchronicity and the likelihood and the luck of being somewhere doing something, then it's not only up to you. And it's a kind of a freeing thing, I thought about it thinking about my podcast or about my books. Like, obviously, I have it on my bucket list, right, to make these books a bestseller or to be considered a best-selling author at some point in the future. At the same time, I am understanding of the fact that there are like 300 million books published every year, and the likelihood of your book making it rather than another is rather low. And, it doesn't mean that I should sort of break down and cry and never write a book again, I will not stop writing, but it does make me reconsider why I'm writing. And maybe this is a little segue, so feel free to skip it if you don't want to hear about this. But I've had a conversation with a friend recently. She's been thinking about writing a book. And one of the first things she asked me about my experience of, sort of self-publishing and writing and going through this arduous process of actually making it happen, she asked at some point, like, well, how should I make it so I make money of it? How can I make sure that this, she basically said something in between the lines of like, well, I don't know if I should commit to it because I would like to know first that it's something that will bring me monetary value, right? That she will make money of it. And I did say to her, and I did quote Bukowski as well in it, I did say to her that, to be honest, if your main motivation to write a book is to gain out of it the monetary value, let's say to sell 1,000 copies or whatever, I wouldn't start, because if there is no pleasure for you in the mere act of writing, similarly to any art, I think, if you don't have joy coming from doing something like that, and if you don't find it to be in itself a success that you did it, no matter whether or not your book will sell or your album will be, played on every radio ever, then you're kind of missing the point, and you're setting yourself up for a big disappointment. Because, let's be honest, the likelihood of your book being any better than the hundreds of thousands or millions out there is rather low. And if the only reason why you're doing it is for money, then there are probably quite a few better ways of spending this arduous and long time than writing a book. Because also, a funny little fact, which is quite upsetting for me, but also I understand that it's true, is not many people read books these days. Which is one of the reasons why I've decided to share the books I'm reading with you on this podcast. Because I know that the grand majority of you, my dear listeners, that are listening to it today or in the near future, you might never pick up the book I'm talking about. So my idea here is, why don't I share with you what I've benefited from the book? If only to encourage you to read it, but also to share with you some ideas, so you kind of don't have to, because maybe you don't have time and you'd rather sort of sift through the information of the book through my own mind, which is fair enough, I'm a sort of a tool, in a sense, for you in that regard. And I don't mind it. I enjoy reading books. I do believe them to be valuable for me. And I just thought, why don't I take it a step further and share it with you? And hopefully you'll benefit from it. Anyway, what I'm talking here about is that if we underestimate the impact of other things on our life, and we overestimate our abilities, then we're setting ourselves up for big surprises again and again. And this is a part of our nature. And there are big parts of the book explaining the different confirmation biases and narrative fallacy and ludic fallacy that play a role in those processes. So please feel free to read the book and see it for yourself. But it's just worth to know. It doesn't mean that you will not forget it in a few weeks and burn yourself again and again, but it might mitigate the impact of that happening. And it's worth considering, I think it's always worth considering, why do you do what you do? Because you have only so much time in a day and so much time in your life. And it's not obvious that you will live much longer than you you think you will, or it's not even obvious that you will be living tomorrow. So contributing or giving away your time to things that don't matter to you only because of some financial gain or whatever, it might not be the best idea, and that's just that. It's worth thinking about that just for your own benefit. Even if you do end up reading and writing, knowing all those things, that's also cool, That's what I do. Anyway, let's continue. Now, an interesting thing that I've mentioned is the narrative fallacy. And that stems from the fact that we think in stories, and to sort of preserve our computing power within our little brain, not so little really, and to sort of to make sense of things, it's very useful for our brains and our minds to put things simply in a sort of 1 after 2 after 3 kind of system, chronologically or not, and to link things together, even though they might not have any correlation or linkage whatsoever in real life. And this is really important to note, because the narrative fallacy basically means that we think in stories and add narratives to everything. We constantly trick ourselves into explaining things even if we have no clue about them. Now, this basically means that you might hear 2 random facts, completely not related, but because for whatever reason they were heard in the same conversation or they were said in the same sentence by someone, you will consider them to be linked, a causality or a correlation kind of a linkage. And that is a problem, This is basically what Mr. Taleb points out to be at the root of our overestimation of knowledge that we have and underestimation of the chaos around us. Because if we do put a story into our mind that is not necessarily true, then our actions going forward regarding that story might further take us away from the truth itself and ultimately maybe even get us in trouble, So it's worth thinking about, I would say. And the interesting thing here is we simplify things to save that energy, let's say. But this means that we're simplifying a highly complex world. And now, a sort of a slowing down of this thought for a moment, just put it into perspective. Humans are said to be around in our sort of ultimate form for around 300,000 years, something like that. And for the past 2,000, we've been in this, let's say, our era. And there are speculations whether or not however many thousands of years we've sort of lived the how do you call it, the nomad life versus the agricultural one. We know that Egypt lasted for about 10,000 years. So whatever, think about it for a moment. Our life today and our world today is so much more intertwined and complex than it was back in the Egyptian times or back in our caveman times. And yet we are pretty much the same. We forget about it a lot, but we have not changed as much within ourselves as we did change the environment around us. We've built so many abstract structures. We have countries, we have stock exchanges, we have artificial intelligence, we have internet, we have cryptocurrencies. We have this means of communicating like I do right now. I'm sitting in a room filled with technology and random things that probably the majority of the people in the past never had a chance to even think about. And I'm speaking to a screen, try to explain a screen to someone from Middle Ages. And this will be broadcasted to the world. And you might be sitting right now, I don't know, in Kuala Lumpur and watching this on your phone, you know? And yet we think we know so much because we are still the same kind of simple creatures. And this is the problem with the simplifying and the narrative fallacy, that basically we, in order to make them more approachable for ourselves to understand, we simplify things that should not be simplified. And we forget how complex the world is. So we overestimate the impact we have, and we highly underestimate the impact of the highly complex world around us has. Now, I did already mention it before, but by now I should probably suggest to you some sort of practical guidance, right? So by now I've mentioned that it will be of benefit to you to try and become more skeptical about your own judgments. And similarly, as I said earlier, it seems to Mr. Taleb, according to many different research papers and especially work by Daniel Kahneman from Thinking Fast and Slow, it actually is beneficial for us to limit the information input so we can see the better picture, which will be in lower resolution, but will be more encompassing, more broad, and because of that might actually be closer to the truth. Now, this might sound like a bit of a surprise for you, right? It's counterintuitive that actually knowing more does not necessarily mean that you will be better prepared for anticipating what might happen. Mr. Taleb here in particular criticizes the arrogance and ignorance of, for example, stock exchange dealers, let's say, the people that basically traders, for example, because he gives us an example of an experiment that was done. Imagine this experiment. Individuals were put in a room and shown a low resolution image of a water hydrant, right? And the images would start from being very, very blurry, and with each image it would become less blurry. Now, there were two groups. One group was offered 4 images, out of which the second one was as blurry as the fourth one in the group that had 8 images, right? So by the time the first group saw the second image out of the 4 altogether, in the second group they already saw 4 images, and that was the 4th out of 8. Now, basically this means that, and what they found, right, what they found. So they found that those individuals that were shown more images more often were more likely to make a mistake, and what they derived from that is the fact that they had more time to come up with their own ideas of what the image represents. So basically what this means is, because you only saw the image 2 times, you might have had 20 ideas of what might be on that image, so you're more likely to guess it than someone who saw the same image but in a sort of 4 steps, and they had double the time and double or triple or quadruple amount of ideas, and so they had less likelihood of guessing what the image represents. And this is very, very important to note, you know. Mr. Taleb said about not watching the news, and something that I've taken a note here of, and I did mention to you before on the podcast, is Personally, I don't really watch news. I don't watch TV. I've not been watching TV. I think last time I had a TV in the living room was when I was living back home, and even then that was before we moved the TV room to a TV room because basically we just didn't want my little brother to be watching cartoons in front of everyone all day. But basically, I've not watched TV for like 15, I don't know, 20 years now maybe. Anyway, if you do watch news, which is fair, you might want to be informed. Maybe your work depends on it. So, for example, Mr. Taleb points out people like, politicians or stock market traders and whatnot. He argues that it's actually much more beneficial for you to watch the news once a week than every day. And this is twofold reason. First point is what we've just said. It's actually more likely for you to keep and sort and make sense of the information you're being offered if you do not overload yourself with information. So that's an interesting thing to note. And secondly, because you're watching those news every week rather than every day, naturally a weekly news letter will be already a sort of pre-sorted for you for the more important news that actually stuck up until the end of that week as a summary, rather than everyday news, which might be 30% important and 70% crap. And do what you want, but it sounds to me like a reasonable idea. Similarly to learning about topics or sort of discussing something, it might be beneficial actually for you to limit the input and to allow your brain and yourself the time to sort through the information instead of overloading it with new information and then causing the simplification and the narrative fallacy and all kinds of those things that we've mentioned before. And yeah, I found that point to be very, very practical. Basically, do not watch the news as often as you do, and you will benefit from it. And maybe also, as we mentioned last week with Unstressable, you will be less stressed because of it. Now, finally, I'm pretty sure I've mentioned this already. You might know something that is called compound interest, or sort of the effect of compounding, an effect of a sort, an impact or whatever. And this is something that also Mr. Taleb points out, and he actually points it out in terms of our happiness, but it can also be translated to our unhappiness. So basically, they did studies, and it turns out that sort of getting things progressively better, for example, you get a raise every 3 months, will impact you more powerfully on your happiness and satisfaction level than if you once in your year or once in your lifetime get a huge amount of money. So even though the end point might be the same, let's say that you got 4 raises over the course of the year, and overall, out of the raises at work you earned an additional £30,000, let's say, or dollars, or zlotys. You might get that same raise happen at one point once, £30,000 just to your pocket. It's a premium, amazing job, well done. You will be less positively impacted by this in long term than by those 4 incremental inputs. And this is because we are wired for progress. We are constantly scanning our environment, our life, our abstract ladders that we've built, whether at work, at a relationship, at the gym, or whatever. And it's more beneficial for you to consistently make progress than to slap yourself with success once and then coast for the next 10 years. And I don't know. I don't know what's your experience with that. For me, it is very, very important to see the progress. And I do track it on my own accord. And something that, Jordan Peterson pointed out in his book quite well is you should compare yourself to yourself from yesterday, not to who someone is today. And I try to do that. And hopefully because of that, I'm becoming better and so forth. So this works the same way in negative. It's actually more detrimental to our mental health and to our satisfaction of life to be consistently falling behind with things, whether it is getting more in debt or your health, sort of going down or stuff like that, or being fired from one job and then the next one and then the next one, than we are from having an impact of just one black swan happening, like, I don't know, losing a limb or whatever. Obviously, that is tragic and will impact you in a great way. But according to those studies, over the long term, one-time tragedy will not be as detrimental to your satisfaction of life, happiness, and health than a slow but steady decline in whatever area of life you are. So I guess the invitation here from that standpoint is to recognize and sort of cherish and strive for those successes and progress over time, rather than just set a really high goal and for the next 5 years don't celebrate anything, don't achieve anything that you find worthy, only to wait for that one big thing, because you might find yourself not so happy with the outcome of that one big thing while you've lived a miserable life over those few years in advance. Now, the actual invitation that I wanted to share with you for this book, and this is the closing part, is to practice skepticism and withholding judgment and stopping yourself from expressing your opinions. We did mention at some point on the podcast that opinions are the cheapest commodity in the world, and they're given away for free all the time. And I know you do, because I do. And quite frankly, my podcast, as much as it might be valuable and I'm trying to keep it that way, it is still very much so impacted by my opinion, right? I'm sharing with you my opinion about the book. I'm sharing with you some facts from the book, but I'm also painting them with a taint of my opinions. And what Mr. Taleb invites us to do is to be more skeptical about our own knowledge and be more courageous in admitting when we don't know and refraining from making opinions and statements and sort of sharing our point of view when we simply do not have a fact-checked certainty that what we say is true. And it is not as easy as you think. And he did underline that as a major problem, that for the most part, you will catch yourself again and again sharing things, ideas, thoughts that you have not checked. And it's just because sometimes we just want to share, sometimes we want to get that 5 pence of our thoughts in the conversation. And the courageous act to do here for the benefit of you and those around you is withhold your judgment. Do not share recklessly, and be more skeptical about what you think you know that you know. So that's the invitation for this week. I hope that it will help you make better decisions and be less affected by the black swans of life. Anyway, thank you so much for listening today. As I mentioned earlier, if you'd like to support the podcast, please follow the link below and also share it with a friend. I had a lot of fun. I'm sorry that it came out as a long episode, but it was worth it. And I hope it was worth for you. Have a wonderful week. Stay happy, stay healthy, and I'll see you next time.